The name's Bond. James Bond. That was the line that introduced us to one of the most classic characters of all time. He's been in movies for more than 60 years, and he's been in novels for even longer than that. And in all the various takes on the character, there's been one thing that's been consistent. He's always wearing a watch. James Bond's watches are about more than just telling time. They can be weapons, they can be communication devices. They're always an extension of his character, and they also reflect the times that that character lives in. Most every James Bond mission begins right here, in M's office. Of course, this isn't really an office, this is actually a set, but I thought it was an appropriate place to begin our mission of delving into the watches of James Bond. Hopefully, you'll learn something that you haven't learned before. I've got a wide array of James Bond-related watches here with me. In fact, this is probably the first time that a lot of these have been in the same room together. But the name's Bernardo, Mark Bernardo. I'm the director of editorial content at teddybaldessar.com, and I'm James Bond's superfan. And I'm going to be taking you today through the history of James Bond's watches. Chapter 1, The Bond of Books. The story of James Bond begins with his creator, author Ian Fleming. Fleming had almost as interesting a life as James Bond himself. He went to a prestigious military academy but flunked out, tried his hand at being a stockbroker and that didn't take. From there, he found a bit of a calling as a journalist for Reuters, and this is where he was exposed to the world of government intelligence gathering and espionage. This led him to a high-level job in the British military, in naval intelligence during World War II. When Fleming left government service, he was determined to make a living as a writer. When he sat down at his writer's desk at his house in Jamaica, he decided that the character that he created was going to be a character very much influenced by his very interesting wartime intelligence experiences. And that character was James Bond. The name James Bond nowadays conjures up images of style and elegance and adventure, but when Ian Fleming chose that name for his character, it was conjuring up anything but. James Bond was the name of an actual ornithologist who wrote books about birds. The reason that he chose what he felt was such a bland name was because the character of James Bond, as he originally envisioned it, was what he called a blunt instrument. A character that didn't really grow, a character that did his mission and other characters grew and evolved around him in the course of that mission. Bond himself was meant to be a catalyst for events more so than a character with a lot of layers. It all started with this book, Casino Royale, published in 1953. It was Ian Fleming's first novel, the first appearance of James Bond, and it set the stage for the entire monster franchise that would follow. Fleming was also a man of discerning tastes, and this came through in the novels that he wrote. He had specific tastes about what he liked to eat, what he liked to drink, and also what watch he wore. Fleming was known to own and wear a Rolex Explorer. The Rolex Explorer, which actually came out the same year as Casino Royale, was known as an adventurer's watch at the time, and what many consider to be the first original real James Bond watch is a Rolex Explorer, despite the fact that it was never worn by any Bond actor on screen. Why it's considered maybe the original James Bond watch is that when Fleming did finally get around to describing James Bond's watch, which wasn't until the second novel, which was Live and Let Die, he described it pretty much how his Rolex Explorer would have been described. He used phrases like big luminous numerals, expanding bracelets, stainless steel case. This is really all the description we ever really got about the watch that James Bond wore in the novels. When it finally came time to bring James Bond to the big screen, it was time for a producer named Albert Cubby Broccoli to enter the scene. A big fan of the novels and really dedicated to making them work on the silver screen. Cubby Broccoli and eventually his family would stay with the franchise for 50 years. Chapter 2, the Sean Connery Era. After the popularity of the James Bond novels, James Bond was destined to be on the big screen. Ian Fleming and Cubby Broccoli and Eon Productions all needed to agree on an actor to play James Bond. Sean Connery, who was actually in that first movie and to many is the quintessential James Bond, was far from a sure thing of getting the role at first. Fleming himself was not really a fan of the Scottish actor. He thought he was a roughneck and didn't project enough of the elegance that he pictured in his character. Broccoli himself was looking for someone like Cary Grant, who was aging at the time but had shown a lot of acting chops in espionage-style movies. Fleming really wanted someone like David Niven or even Richard Burton to play the role, but Connery won everybody over with his signature toughness mixed with elegance. The first Bond movie was Dr. No in 1962, and to many, this established the quintessential James Bond for the movies. The first watch that we see James Bond wearing is one that many people probably would be unaware of. It was a small gold dress watch, Gruen Precision 510, and while he does not wear the watch throughout the entirety of the movie, he is wearing that watch in the now classic scene where we first meet Sean Connery's Bond in the dinner jacket, in the casino, uttering for the first time the famous line, "Bond, James Bond." Gruen was a brand based in Ohio, an American watch brand back in the day when America hosted a lot more watch brands that eventually moved its production to Switzerland. And the Gruen may have actually been Connery's own watch. The watch that we more associate with early cinematic James Bond, and particularly Sean Connery, is a much more famous model. It was a Rolex Submariner reference 6538. No one is really quite sure, but as the story goes, the producers knew that James Bond was supposed to wear a Rolex. And Cubby Broccoli owned a Submariner. People have speculated over the years that it was Connery's own Submariner, but the evidence more seems to point that it was Broccoli's watch, and he lent it to Connery to wear on screen. You get a glimpse of the Rolex Submariner on Connery's wrist in the famous scene where Ursula Andress as Honey Rider comes out of the surf to greet James Bond, who's sleeping on the beach. The second Bond movie was From Russia with Love in 1963, just a year after the first one. It's again starred Sean Connery as James Bond, wearing his same Rolex Submariner. Trivia about From Russia with Love: the novel was President John F. Kennedy's favorite book, and he said so in an interview, which was another factor that helped in the popularity of the Bond novels and eventually led to the James Bond movies. It also led to the decision to make From Russia with Love the second movie, though it wasn't actually the second novel. And what happened was JFK was so excited that his favorite book was being made into a movie that he screened it at the White House in 1963. The tragic footnote is that he screened it the night before he left for Dallas, where he was assassinated. So this really cements that movie as a marker in 60s culture. I learned that just a week ago. Yeah. Goldfinger in 1964 was really the first Bond movie that set the tone for the series. With the gadgets, the outlandish villains, the double entendres, it was also the first Bond movie that gave us a close-up of James Bond's watch. The scene of James Bond in his dinner jacket checking his Rolex Submariner on its military-style NATO strap is the scene that really established for many watch enthusiasts that this was the watch of James Bond. There were actually two Rolexes on screen in Goldfinger. One was the sub worn by Connery. The other was a Rolex GMT Master, which was worn by Honor Blackman in her role as Pussy Galore. It was an appropriate watch for the character because Pussy Galore was actually a pilot and a leader of a squadron of flying lady pilots who had worked for the villain Goldfinger. The GMT Master was also a fairly new model at the time. They had all come out around 1953, 1954. The Submariner, the GMT Master, the Explorer, and it was a rare occurrence where both these classic models appeared in a James Bond movie. The GMT Master, worn by Pussy Galore, has since gone on to become nicknamed the Pussy Galore watch. The next movie in 1965 was Thunderball, and that is the movie where we're introduced to the Breitling Top Time. Connery was once again wearing the Rolex Submariner in this movie, but he also wore another watch. It was a Breitling Top Time, and in the movie, the watch was equipped with a Geiger counter that Bond used to track a cache of stolen nuclear weapons. In reality, the watch was a chronograph. I have a modern version of it on right now. It was a chronograph that was made by Breitling in the early 1960s and intended it for the growing cadre of motorsport enthusiasts and people who are into muscle cars and motorcycles and racing. And it was designed to be a more youthful oriented tool watch. It made several memorable appearances on screen. In 1967, Connery made the last of his original run of James Bond film, You Only Live Twice. It took place largely in Japan. In this movie, we didn't see Connery wearing a Submariner. We saw him once again wearing a Gruen Precision 510, which was apparently the actor's own watch. I'm not sure why he went with only this watch in that movie, but there were no gadgets in it, and it pretty much served a subtle role as Bond's timepiece. Diamonds Are Forever in 1971 was Sean Connery's last official appearance as James Bond. Eventually, he would do a movie called Never Say Never Again, which was basically a remake of Thunderball, which was not part of the official Bond canon, all of which gets into a lot of legal wrangling that was going on at the time between Fleming's estate and the producers. Diamonds Are Forever is really the last time that we see Connery as part of the accepted Bond universe. And in this movie, the Gruen Precision 510 is once again back, and we do not see a Rolex Submariner. After Diamonds Are Forever, Connery was no longer interested in doing more James Bond movies and was probably aging out of the role. Thus, the search for a new Bond had to begin again. Chapter 3, The Lazenby Interlude. Now that Sean Connery had left the role of James Bond, the producers of the series were in an interesting position of having to fill his very, very impressive shoes, find a new actor to play 007. What was very unlikely was that an Australian model with very little acting experience would be the one to emerge as the next James Bond. But that is exactly what happened. As the story goes, he met Cubby Broccoli in a barber shop and impressed him, but he had no acting experience to speak of. So he faked a resume to show to the producers. He went in and supposedly bought himself a Rolex Submariner of the same type that he had seen Connery wear in the movies to help impress the people he was auditioning for. He also wore a suit, a very Connery-like, Bond-like suit that Connery himself had apparently ordered but never picked up. How he was able to do this is fairly unclear. But long story short, he did manage to impress the casting team enough that he was cast as James Bond in the next movie, which was 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It was one of the most significant Bond movies, despite the fact that George Lazenby would never do another one after this. From a watch standpoint, he was fairly similar to Connery. He did wear a Submariner, probably the same one that he had brought to that legendary audition. But he also wore a chronograph from Rolex, which we now would call a Rolex Daytona. But if you're really into Rolex, it was a Rolex pre-Daytona, because it had come out in the years before the watch had acquired that nickname. To my knowledge, it's the only time that a Rolex Daytona was ever seen on screen in a Bond movie. With George Lazenby out and Sean Connery out, it was now time to find a third James Bond. Chapter 4, The Roger Moore Era. In the early 1970s, there was another search for a new James Bond, and this one landed on English actor Roger Moore, who brought a slightly more polished, elegant feel to the character, less rough around the edges maybe than Connery, and he was a new Bond for a new era. The era was also changing drastically for the world of watches, and this would really significantly have an impact on the watches that we would see James Bond wearing in these movies that came out in the 70s and in the 80s. The watch industry was experiencing what we now refer to as the quartz crisis. This was a result of the development of quartz battery-powered movements that were able to make watches run more efficiently and also make them cheaper. Companies like Seiko and Citizen and Casio from Japan and others from the East were adopting this quartz technology and really kind of taking over the market with these newer, cheaper timepieces, which eventually would lead to more complicated, high-tech digital timepieces. All of this would have an impact on the James Bond movies, but not right away. The first Roger Moore movie was Live and Let Die in 1973, which was actually based on the second Fleming novel. Moore was wearing a Rolex Submariner, a reference 5513. The Rolex Submariner in that movie had a couple of functions. One of them was a magnet that Bond used to unzip a lady's dress, which was kind of an indication of the type of Bond that Roger Moore was going to portray in the 70s. There was another watch worn in the famous speedboat chase scene in Live and Let Die that many, even very knowledgeable Bond watch enthusiasts are unaware of. And it was a watch much like this one, a Tissot PR516. And as far as we know, it's the only Tissot that's ever been in a Bond movie. And the speculation has been that it was Roger Moore's own Tissot watch. Most importantly, for our discussion about the evolution of James Bond's wristwear in the 1970s, Live and Let Die ushered in the era of the digital watch in James Bond movies. Roger Moore wore a Hamilton Pulsar, of which this is a modern revival in the current collection. It was the first LED digital watch, originally out in 1970 and originally available only in gold. It was a fairly simple watch at the time. The technology hadn't really advanced. Much like this one, it had a quiet digital face until you activated the pusher on the side and it showed red digital numerals. The original Hamilton Pulsar from the 1970s was actually a very expensive watch. We don't picture digital watches today as being that, but it was quite a luxury product at the time. Initially, it was available only in gold, and eventually it became available in steel. We actually get a really good shot of the Hamilton Pulsar in the darkness, where we see the red digital numerals pop up. Moore's second movie and the follow-up to Live and Let Die was 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun. This one was another movie where Moore wore a Rolex Submariner, and in this movie it wasn't equipped with gadgets. Moore's Rolex in The Man with the Golden Gun pretty much served strictly as a timekeeper. This movie, generally not a favorite of enthusiasts. It's got a lot of interesting facts associated with it because as a novel, it was published after Fleming's death, and word is that Fleming never really finished it in the sense that he never had gone through his editing process. So it was a bit more raw as a novel. So maybe the source material itself was a little bit holding it back. Other trivia associated with the movie is that Christopher Lee, who played the villain Scaramanga, the titular man with the golden gun in the movie, was related to Ian Fleming. He was a step cousin and he used to golf with Fleming and allegedly was even offered the role of Dr. No in the first movie that was ultimately played by Joseph Wiseman. The Man with the Golden Gun was not a huge success as far as these movies go, but it set the stage for the next one, which was one of the biggest blockbusters of its time. That was The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977. So the digital era, which was teased at in the previous movie, was starting to make its presence felt in this one because the other watch that James Bond wore was a Seiko 0674LC in a scene that probably looks pretty low-tech now, high-tech at the time. That watch printed out a ticker tape message for Bond to report to M. That's about the most impressive thing that it did. But it was a basic digital watch, but it also might have marked the beginning of watch product placement in the James Bond movies. Product placement wasn't really a thing in the 1960s when the movies started, and as I've said before, Rolex would never have given them a watch to use without any kind of special agreement like that. So Seiko is listed as a partner in the credits in this movie, and we'd see Seiko in future ones as well. There was another big hit movie in 1977 called Star Wars, and that movie would have a large impact on what would be the next James Bond movie, 1979's Moonraker. The filmmakers decided to take futuristic, high-tech spin on it. James Bond in space adventure is pretty much how everybody remembers that movie. And appropriately, it would also be a movie where high-tech watches would take the stage solely. It was the first movie where James Bond wore only Seikos. One of the ones that Moore wore for this movie was an M534 Seiko memory bank calendar. In the movie, it was used as a remote detonator. In real life, it had this kind of oddball function of a calendar that could remember any date all the way up to the somewhat random endpoint of 2009. As we're now on the cusp of the 1980s, it's interesting to see how watch technology was evolving, and we will see more of that as the watch world and the Bond movie franchise moves into the 80s. In anticipation of the release of Moonraker, Seiko even made a TV advertisement for the watch featuring scenes of James Bond from the movie. It was really a sign that watches and movie making were starting to get more involved and that James Bond was being used to sell watches. It's also interesting that the first time we see James Bond in a watch commercial, it's not for a Rolex, it's not for an Omega, it's for a rather humble but very cool Seiko digital watch. Roger Moore returned again in 1981's For Your Eyes Only, and in this movie he was wearing multiple watches from Seiko. One of them was a rather historical dive watch from Seiko, which was nicknamed the Golden Tuna, as you can see from the odd tuna can shaped case. This watch was significant for Seiko in its history because it was one of the first compressor dive watches that was built to withstand helium buildup inside a diving bell. Watch companies had addressed this problem, especially Rolex, with their Sea Dweller model, but all those watches had used a different solution. They had used a built-in helium release valve that screwed into the case to release the buildup so the case and crystal wouldn't pop open. Seiko chose a different technological route to that. They actually just built a case that was really, really strong and waterproof to 600 meters. And this watch followed Roger Moore into an important scene in the movie. We also start to see a bit of the analog era start to creep back in because Roger Moore also wears an analog digital Seiko in this movie, which is called a duo display, displaying the time in two different methods. It would be an early harbinger of a swing back to a more traditional watch for 007, but not quite yet. With Octopussy in 1983, the 80s were in full swing, and so was the digital era of watchmaking. One of the craziest Seiko watches made its appearance in this movie, on the wrist, once again, of Roger Moore. This is an actual period-specific model of the long-gone Seiko TV watch. Roger Moore wore this watch both for business and pleasure in Octopussy. He used it on his mission, and he also used it to leer at women on the tiny little screen. It feels weird just even saying it. Yeah, all right.
How do you say that?
Yeah. At the time, this watch was in the Guinness Book of World Records as having the smallest ever TV screen, like 1 inch and a fourth. The watch did not last that long on the market. It was a hit because of its novelty, but the picture quality was really bad, and it needed a battery pack and an antenna and just lots and lots of extras to go with it. It was not as simple as Roger Moore made it look in the movie. Seiko also made an advertisement for the TV watch, which aired on regular TV, and it showed scenes from the movie once again, as the previous commercial had done. A View to a Kill in 1985 was the final bow for Roger Moore as James Bond, and it was the final bow for Seiko as the official Bond watch. Roger Moore wore at least 3 Seikos. There was an analog date watch, there was an analog quartz chronograph, and another version of the Golden Tuna that had both an analog and a digital display. The quartz chronograph was somewhat significant, as it was the first quartz analog chronograph. That was another innovation that Seiko could take pride in. In a scene toward the end of the movie, there's a climactic battle between Bond and the villain played by Christopher Walken on the Golden Gate Bridge. In that scene, Moore looks to be wearing a Rolex Datejust. And discussion has cropped up over the years over what that watch actually is, how it got in the movie, was it Moore's own watch? But it's more likely that it's probably a Seiko that looked like a Datejust. With Seiko being an official partner of the films at this stage, that's probably the more likely thing, which would make the Submariner and GMT Master and Lazenby's pre-Daytona still the only Rolex watches that have been in the James Bond movies. A View to a Kill was Roger Moore's last James Bond movie, and the search for a new Bond was on again. Chapter 5, Timothy Dalton's Bond. As the 80s were drawing to a close, there was a long and exhaustive search for the next actor to play James Bond. The role was actually offered to Pierce Brosnan, who was on TV at the time playing a suave detective called Remington Steele. Many who watched that show saw him as a natural to take over the role of James Bond. Unfortunately, NBC, who made Remington Steele and had Pierce Brosnan under contract, did not allow him out of that contract to go and make the movies. So anyone who wanted to see Pierce Brosnan in that role would have to wait for a while before they would actually see it happen. They finally landed on Welsh actor Timothy Dalton for the role of Bond, who was really playing kind of a tougher, grimmer, and more no-nonsense Bond, more brooding, a little bit more hardened by life, though still with those classic characteristics that we associate with Bond. The eye for the ladies, the taste for martinis. It was very different. Not everybody loved the choice. Much like now, it's hard to find everyone to agree. But the first Timothy Dalton movie, The Living Daylights in 1987, did very, very well. There was also an entirely new watch on James Bond's wrist in this movie, and it was the Tag Heuer Night Diver. At the time, this watch was never really seen all that clearly on screen, which is why it's been fairly recent that sharp-eyed watch enthusiasts have discovered it. It's so unclear on screen, in fact, that we don't know whether the logo said Tag Heuer, as the current one does, or the original plain Heuer. Because, as it happens, as this movie was being made, the original Heuer company was being taken over by Technique d'Avant-Garde, which was the company that was initialed Tag. There were watches with both logos still on the racks, so we really don't know which one the filmmakers used. There were in fact other Tag Heuer watches spotted on other characters in that movie, including the villain, so it's possible that Tag Heuer had some kind of relationship with the movie, though it's never been plainly stated that they did. 2 years after The Living Daylights, in 1989, came Dalton's second and final movie called License to Kill, a reference to James Bond's 007 number. So the plot of License to Kill is fairly low stakes as far as Bond movies go. It's Bond versus a drug cartel. He's not saving the world or blowing up Blofeld's space laser or anything like that. Again, not generally a favorite of a lot of Bond fans, and it was also the last appearance in a Bond movie of a Rolex Submariner. Timothy Dalton wore a Submariner date, reference 16610, and his stunt double wore a slightly different Submariner. And the stunt double's watch was actually probably more valuable at auction for watch collectors because it was the watch that was actually used in, rough and tumble action scenes in the movie and showed the scars of it. Timothy Dalton was finished with the role of James Bond, and it would be 6 years before we'd see James Bond on screen again. Chapter 6, The Pierce Brosnan Era. James Bond disappeared from movie screens for a long time, and it wasn't certain he was ever coming back. Part of it was a lawsuit that was going on between MGM and Eon Productions over the ownership of the property. It was a real discussion as to whether James Bond's time had passed. Fortunately, the lawsuit was resolved, and there were still James Bond movies to be made. And this time, the filmmakers could actually get Pierce Brosnan. For the next movie, which would be 1995's GoldenEye. GoldenEye was actually the name of Ian Fleming's house in Jamaica. And in the movie, it was used for the space weapon that everyone was after, especially the villain played by Sean Bean. Pierce Brosnan was the new James Bond in GoldenEye. And the new James Bond had a brand new watch. And this watch was an Omega Seamaster diver, much like the one I have here. The story behind how Bond came to wear an Omega Seamaster is kind of an interesting one. Omega is the Swiss watch company that officially partnered with the studios making the Bond films in 1995, becoming the official first watch of James Bond. Seiko, despite doing product placement, never really touted that as a title. But Omega has had a long-running relationship, and it continues to this day. How Omega tells the story is that costume designer Lindy Hemming, who came on board with Brosnan to do the wardrobe in GoldenEye, suggested that James Bond, who was a former Navy man, a former naval intelligence officer, would wear a dive watch like the Seamaster. Brosnan saw the watch, liked the watch a lot, especially the blue dial. It was actually a quartz watch. It was the Seamaster 300 meter reference 2451. In the movie, it was equipped with several gadgets, including a laser beam that was operated by twisting the bezel, also a remote detonator for an explosive device. Both of these were added to the watch by Q Branch in the movie. They were put to good use by Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. Omega leaned into the relationship with Bond heavily from very early on, producing a TV commercial with footage from GoldenEye to sell the Omega Seamaster. And it was the start of a very long and fruitful advertising and marketing relationship between Omega and the Bond movie series. The video game based on GoldenEye was just an earth-shakingly popular game at the time. Culturally, it was very significant, and it helped catapult Brosnan's Bond, as well as the Omega and other elements from that movie, even larger into the public consciousness. If you pause the game GoldenEye, you can very clearly see a watch that is modeled very much after the Omega Seamaster. 2 years after GoldenEye came Tomorrow Never Dies, Brosnan's second movie. Brosnan was very enamored of the blue-dialed Omega Seamaster that he wore and made famous in GoldenEye, and he wore another version of that watch in the next movie. This one, however, reflecting the move that the watch industry was making from quartz back into more sophisticated luxury mechanicals, he wore a Seamaster with a mechanical movement. This one was the Seamaster reference 2531.80.00. It had caliber 1120, which was made exclusively for Omega. In the movie, the watch has a lot more things built into it. We see it in use in several action sequences. It's equipped with a detonator for a hand grenade. Bond sticks with his blue-dialed Seamaster in his third movie, The World Is Not Enough, in 1999. In that movie, the watch is equipped with a piton and a grappling hook that Brosnan's Bond uses to get himself out of a jam. Pierce Brosnan returned for what would turn out to be his final turn as Bond in Die Another Day in 2002. Brosnan stuck with his blue-dialed Seamaster in that movie. This watch once again had a remote detonator built into it, this time activated by twisting the watch's bezel. It also had a laser that you could activate by touching the dial, both of which serve Bond well, as his gadgets always do. By the time the Brosnan movies were done, there was a sense that maybe they'd gone a little too far back into the campiness that had turned off viewers at the end of the Moore run. It was clear to many that it was time for Bond to really go back to his roots. Chapter 7, Daniel Craig's Bond. After another long search, another actor was chosen to play James Bond, an English actor named Daniel Craig, with very few well-known film credits, and he was blonde. So the controversy over casting him in the beginning was really intense, as we were now in the age of the internet. However, Craig would win over most, if not all, of his early detractors with his take on James Bond. After Pierce Brosnan, the filmmakers returned to Bond's roots in the most literal way possible by adapting, finally, the novel Casino Royale, Fleming's first novel, the first appearance of James Bond. People who had seen a lot of James Bond movies could tell that things were different. It was a little grittier. It was a little more violent. Craig was more of a man of few words and very smoldering intensity that was a bit far from the charm of Pierce Brosnan. To many longtime fans, Craig's portrayal of Bond was about the most book-accurate one of all the actors that had played him. He was also, as it turns out in real life, into watches and played a rather active role going forward in the type of watches that 007 would wear on screen. The movie even has a scene when Bond and Vesper Lynd are having their first conversation. Eva Green, as Vesper, notices the watch on Bond's wrist and says something to the effect of, "Nice watch, Rolex?" And he, of course, quickly corrects her with Omega. So we're left with no doubt as to who is the official watchmaker of James Bond in 2006. Craig was seen wearing two Omega Seamaster watches in Casino Royale. One was a version of the blue-dialed Seamaster that Brosnan had worn in all of his films. The other one was from the Omega Planet Ocean collection, more of a tough dive watch, 600-meter dive watch. The Planet Ocean referenced 2900.50.91. The Planet Ocean was the one used mostly in the outdoor action scenes, whereas the Seamaster was the one in the more elegant scenes. The watches would change, but this formula for the Craig movies was something that was kind of set here and would continue in the movies that followed. Quantum of Solace came out in 2008. It served largely as a sequel to the events in Casino Royale. It's not a favorite of most. I think on repeat viewings it holds up. Daniel Craig does once again wear an Omega Planet Ocean in this movie. The reference 2201.50.00. As much as Quantum of Solace may have disappointed some viewers, Skyfall was Daniel Craig's third movie, and it was the most critically acclaimed Bond movie in a while. Bond is still wearing Omega watches. He wears an Aqua Terra from the Seamaster's more dressy subfamily in some of the indoor scenes, whereas he wears another Planet Ocean 600-meter watch in a lot of the outdoor action-oriented scenes. Spectre was the next movie in 2015. And it brought back another long missing element from the Bond films. It was missing because of yet another legal dispute, which was the criminal organization Spectre and its leader, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who was, of course, Bond's arch nemesis in the novels as well as in many of the movies. Christoph Waltz, a very acclaimed actor, came on board as Blofeld, and Daniel Craig was continuing to wear Omega. This movie was the first appearance on screen for James Bond of a Seamaster 300. If you compare it with the Seamaster Diver, it's a much more vintage-looking piece. It's got the broad arrow hands. It's based on a watch that was really intended more as a dress watch than as an actual watch for diving. So Craig liked that vintage look of the Seamaster 300 and adapted that for his role in that movie. In the movie, the Seamaster 300 that Craig wears is on a NATO strap. That was very likely a conscious call out to the Rolex worn by Sean Connery in Goldfinger, which was seen close up on a very similar strap. So the Bond movies are well known for making internal references at times, and I think this was one of those. No Time to Die represented a big sea change in the James Bond series. It also marked the last appearance of Daniel Craig as James Bond. The movie was, of course, plagued, as many other movies were at that time, by delays due to the outbreak of COVID-19. And because of this, the watch that was to make its debut in No Time to Die actually came out a year or more before the movie it was in actually was released. So it was actually possible in 2020 to say that I'm wearing the watch that James Bond wore in No Time to Die, even though No Time to Die had not actually come out, because Omega needed to market the watch. Craig was very heavily involved himself in the production of that particular Seamaster Diver 300. There are pictures of Craig visiting Omega's factory in Switzerland, in case anyone is unclear as to how involved he was. As a watch, it was a very cool piece in and of itself. I actually did get to wear that watch and review it a while back. It was made of titanium, which made sense because lightness is always something desirable in a dive watch or a watch that you're going to wear into adventures, as James Bond did. It had British military markings on it, which would indicate a watch owned by the British government, which James Bond's watches technically all probably should be. It's still on sale now, along with other versions of the Seamaster. It's called the 007 edition. It doesn't have any really garish movie type details on it that are obvious, so it's actually a very cool looking Seamaster watch with a connection to the most recent James Bond film. And that brings us all the way up to today. At the time of recording this, No Time to Die has been the most recent Bond movie. Daniel Craig has announced that he is leaving the role. The search is actively ongoing and the debate is actively ongoing about who the next James Bond will be and what watch will he be wearing. We'll all find out in due time. One thing's for certain, however, James Bond and his relationship with watches has been a key element of his character from the novels going all the way up to the most recent big screen blockbuster, and we don't expect that to change. Next time you see James Bond, whoever's playing him, don't forget to take a look at his wrist.